Don't forget to mute when you're not talking. We are live now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this panel discussion with distinguished people in various parts of the world with various things to say and answer this question. Is the global economy retracting? I am Ambassador Terry Earthwind Nichols, along with my co-host, Ambassador Lisa Gable. Lisa, this is going to be quite a discussion.
It will be, and we just so appreciate having wonderful thought leaders who have various perspectives as well as geographical perspectives on what's going on. And as we started this conversation, we saw Putin has been discussing his aims to reverse the Cold War victory of the United States and its allies. He seems to be working hand in hand with China. The question on the table is the global economy retracting? And I know, Shane, you were first up to answer that question with your own thoughts.
Thanks, Lisa. I guess I would equivocate a little bit and say kind of. A lot of this depends on where you're coming from. We know from IMF estimates that this year overall global growth is going to slow down, but not by that much. But amongst advanced economies, it's expected to slow down by quite a lot, an almost shocking amount. Whereas in sort of emerging economies, you're actually seeing an increased growth over last year. So from that perspective, it's a little bit hard to say. I think that just the overall uncertainties in this sort of geopolitical and sort of social situations we have now, and questions over what governance is going to look like, regulations for tech and climate and so on like that, is affecting a lot of how investors think and whether they're sort of putting in shorter term and longer term investments, and how we grapple with those uncertainties and create some sort of an environment to be more forward looking. To me, will be what decides whether the answer to this question in the next few years is going to be yes or no.
Terry, I think you're on mute, so I'm going to take it from here on the next question. Dan Rundy, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Ambassador Gable. Thanks for this opportunity. It's the return of geopolitics and geoeconomics. I would say that we're still coming out of COVID. We're still dealing with the hangover of COVID. We're still, you've seen a number of things that have, as a result of that, we're thinking about de-risking supply chains as a result of COVID. Second, there have been a series of major disruptions to the global economy related to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Russia's invasion has caused not only a humanitarian crisis, but also an economic one. Shocks to food prices, shocks to energy prices that have impacted the world's poorest countries as a result of this illegal invasion, and has had negative impacts around the world. And I think third is the issue of the ongoing major debt crisis in the global south. This is not as covered or well reported as it should be, but global indebtedness has reached unprecedented levels, and the international community is only now thinking through the potential wave of global debt crises in developing countries, from whether it's Sri Lanka, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Zambia. As of 2022, 60% of low-income countries were either experiencing or at risk of debt distress. All that to say is, yes, I think there's a lot of risk for a significant slowdown, and because of these drags, because of these geoeconomic and geopolitical shocks that continue to reverberate even from the pandemic onwards. And so I think we're seeing a series of drags that are going to hold back global growth.
Yes, my mute works now. So I'll say hi, and we'll pass this on to Corey Johnston. I think that area of the world, I'm talking about China and related issues. Corey, come on in.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the question on, is a global economy retracting? I would say it's a little bit too early to tell, but all indicators is that it's slowing. I would almost argue that it's becoming more fragmented and more segmented, and there's an increased level of anxiety that's being driven by foundations that have been there for a little bit that have come to the surface. Things specific to China, Terry, since you asked, things like transparency issues, where you're starting to see more alignment from governments, from private sector as well, who previously were at odds with each other, are now getting on alignment with can we increase transparency? So I think it's a little bit too early to tell, but I do know that this anxiety is driving policies in countries to friendshore, to onshore. And I think those trends will definitely continue as we look forward. But I look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. We brought up Ukraine, and we have Sergey Kreitman here, who's more than just a little bit knowledgeable about that conflict. Thanks for coming, Sergey. And what's your thoughts on the shrinking or possible retracting?
Thank you, Terry. To echo what Daniel and Corey have said, I think the international rules, world order is being threatened by Russia, and therefore a lot of people who cannot completely separate, dealing economically with the state of world affairs and geopolitics, they're forced to make a lot of less rational decisions where friendshoring and onshoring will only continue to pick up, since it doesn't make sense for a lot of countries and corporations to deal with countries like Russia. And of course, China is a big unknown for next 5 or 10 years in regards to Taiwan. So in that regard, there is inflation, there is inefficiency, but there is also important rebuilding of supply chains. And what COVID was sort of the first punch for the US to understand how dependent we have been on China here. For Europe, the second punch was obviously the reliance on Russian natural gas. And while European countries benefited from building up inventories as well as from very mild winter last time, it's very much unknown what kind of winter we will get this season. And therefore, I think the energy independence and the risks to European economy could still be quite significant in coming months and quarters.
Yes, good points all. Miles, we're going to bring you in now.
All right, thank you very much. I don't have anything particularly earth-shattering to say, but I would say that I heard the words like anxiety, uncertainty. That's not just about the regular cycle of up and down the market in the near term, because this anxiety, this uncertainty reflects some kind of a structural flaws that we're realizing, because for nearly 25 years, we live in the fantasy of the flat earth, that all the obstacles for progress, economic, global kumbaya is gone. So we're in a system of interdependency. Those fantasy was shattered in the last year or two by two things, obviously. One is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which basically woke Europe to this very sad reality of over-dependency on Russia for energy and over-dependency on China for trade, and of course, over-dependency on the United States for security. So they were in the mood of panic right now without knowing the clear direction of what's going. So anxiety, uncertainty do not really bode well for a healthy recovery of short-term economic existence. But far more importantly, I think this anxiety and uncertainty is a reflection of a major structural flaw. And I would say the biggest contradiction of our times, that is, we allow a profoundly non-market economy like China to enjoy the full membership of international free market trading system. And we're realizing China is not a market-driven economy. And that dilemma is driving everybody crazy. Certainly, Europeans and Americans were thinking about how to solve this problem, unless you do something structural, fundamental. So this anxiety, this uncertainty will prolong. And you can see from China's economic behavior recently since COVID, and none of which is really bodes well for a future health recovery of the economy. So what I'm trying to say here is we have to think big. We have to really have some structural 1945, 1946, 1947 type of restructuring of global economy. Other than that, I don't feel very optimistic about the future of global economy.
Good points all, definitely. Somebody always has to be last. Ambassador Aina, it just happened to be you. Again, welcome to this conversation from Nigeria. And your perspective, there's a lot of countries, Russia, et cetera, that are trying to influence what's going on in Africa. There's a lot of coups going on right now. What are you hearing out there with regards to answering the question, is the global economy retracting, sir?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Terry, for having me. And I think everybody has made quite significant contributions in terms of whether or not the global economy is retracting. But one very fundamental thing that you cannot take away from this conversation is the peculiarity of the African side. You've said it all in terms of the coup within the West African region. And looking at the geopolitics, geoeconomic, it's having fundamental implications, across the entire continent. And if you look at what is happening within the West African region, where Nigeria is playing a major role, we also agree with me there have been different school of thought, around where Russia is kind of influencing the leadership, where the Americans or the Westerns are influencing the economy. And there's also, a narrative going on now where the African leaders are saying, can you allow Africa to evolve on its own? There are quite specific peculiarities that are common to the African nations that, again, we don't need in any way to begin to align with the Western community. But how the whole thing will span out, we want to begin to see within the next couple of months how, especially, the role that Nigeria will play in shaping the economic landscape of the continent. And don't forget that we just have a new president who is also, in a way, bottled with a lot of problems, both internationally and internally, which again is quite overwhelming on how to be able to navigate through the storm. So Africa is a bit peculiar because it's no longer a no-brainer that it appears that if you look at the entire, supply chain issues, Africa is left out in that entire process. So a lot of very serious, resources have been taken away from the continent without much development in terms of how they can empower the people, bring a lot of people out of poverty. If you look at the inflation rate across all the countries in Africa, it's so overwhelming and very disturbing. But how the whole thing will span out in the next couple of months, it's yet to be seen. Different conversations, different narratives. But again, it's a good place to listen to all we have to say and to contribute here and to see how the whole thing will span out. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Excellent perspective. And, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who are listening in, again, thank you for listening in. And those of you who are going to hear this recording later, our intent, my co-host, Ambassador Lisa, and I, is to give a geographical connection to what's going on out there, and the fact that early conversations to put this program together today was around the lethargic thoughts of the majority of the population. And what we're seeing by the different news programs around the world seems to be laissez-faire. It's anything but laissez-faire, ladies and gentlemen. This is reminiscent, and it's been brought up in a couple of conversations recently that I've had, and that is pre-World War II. Everybody said, nobody's going to come after America. Nobody's going to do this. Nobody's going to do that. And major things went wrong. And it plunged us into World War II. Is that coming now? I'm not real sure that it is. However, we have a very educated society out there who runs off of one of these, and that is power. We can talk to anyone, anywhere in the world, live, and we can show anyone, anywhere in the world, live, what's going on with different geographical areas. Lisa, you've got some great questions.
I do, and I'm actually going to give Henry Wang a twofer because I'm not sure we allowed him to answer the question, is the global economy retracting? So Henry, you get two questions. If you haven't answered the first one yet, that's your first question. And the second question is that, really, is the contemporary landscape still dominated by an ideological struggle between capitalism and socialism, or are we interpreting these situations as power struggles for economic ascendancy? And added to that is who's winning the conflict. So, Henry, why don't you go ahead and I'll let you answer both.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lisa, for posing two very important questions. Let me try to answer both of them together. Yeah, because these are questions, very important questions, which we've also discussed in the B20 Task Force and Action Council. I was honored to be invited by the G20 presidency of India to work with global leaders and CEOs and experts from over 20 countries around the world for the last 10 months or so to prepare our new policy recommendation to the G20 leaders. And really, in terms of the global economy, I think we see growth in some significant areas, but also retraction in some very key areas. Let me give you a very good example. I mean, I think global leaders are now, and global CEOs are all now coming to see that climate change and global warming is really rapidly becoming some of the top threats to countries, to their countries and their companies. I think over 97% of the CEO that were involved have said that their company have been negatively affected by climate change. Therefore, they are really, countries and companies are accelerating clean energy transition. And in that sense, you can see that they are rapidly, transitioning out, replacing their fossil fuel usage by clean energy, renewable energy. Therefore, there may be some retractions in the fossil fuel areas, but there might need to more clever use of fossil fuel, such as, chemical feedstocks and other areas. And in fact, you can see some of the chemical plants and refineries in the Middle East and in other countries are now expanding so that they will convert fossil fuel into valuable feedstock, chemical feedstocks and other areas. But really in the area of renewables and green finance and sustainable investment, this is an area that is huge. And with the B20 leaders, we see that the work we presented to the G20 leaders and what I've also covered in my recent book on the roadmap to sustainable business and net zero emissions is we see that if all the countries work together on climate change mitigation, then this could create a huge economic boom in terms of green economy and low carbon economy. This, so this is an area which could be for rapid growth. I hope these are interesting points, which happy to discuss more. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you. And thank you for providing a different perspective from the climate perspective. Dan, if I can toss it to you, do you see this as an ideological struggle that we've faced in the past? Or are we looking at a global power struggle?
That's a really interesting question, Ambassador Gable. Thanks for putting it to me. So I just wrote a book called The American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power. We're certainly in an age of great power competition. So I think many people have argued we're in a second Cold War. I have eschewed the term second Cold War because I think it brings with it a lot of baggage. But I think great power competition is probably good enough is a good kind of working definition. So we're certainly in an age of great power competition. There is an overlay, so it's a little bit of both, Ambassador Gable, in the sense that there is a power struggle, power competition, but there's also, I think, some ideological underpinnings to it. I'd have said from the 2008 financial crisis till about 2020, there were a lot of folks that said, boy, that that China model, the Chinese Communist Party model of development, that was better than others. And there was a moment sort of from 2008, and I'd say through about for 4 or 5 years, where sort of democratic capitalism was on the back foot. If you look at things have happened since 2020 because of COVID, because of the very significant slowdown in the Chinese economy, because of the repression of entrepreneurs like Jack Ma and others, there's been a significant rethinking of that model. And it's a little bit, I would argue that sort of the state-owned enterprises, sort of central commanded, central planned economies is much more on the back foot today. The problem is the China, led by the Chinese Communist Party, is the second largest economy in the world. I believe they will not surpass the United States because of their internal problems, and especially because of a series of demographic and human capital challenges that they have. But they're going to be part of the global furniture, if you will. They're going to be a big, they're going to be a big part of they're going to be with us for the rest of our for the next, for a really long time. And so we're going to have to work with them. So we are in a competition. We don't want to be in a shooting war. We don't want to be in a straight on Cold War, though many people in Washington think we are in a straight up second Cold War. I've eschewed the term, but I think we need to find ways. Ultimately, we need to have, the West needs to be able to speak to have a positive, forward-looking agenda that speaks to the hopes and aspirations of our friends and potential friends, because we can't fight something with nothing. We can't say to our friends in Africa, don't take Belt and Road money. Don't take the Huawei telecom system. Don't take the Sinovac vaccines. If we're saying to them, we're not going to give you the top shelf Pfizer stuff, or we're not going to enable an alternative on infrastructure, we're not going to enable an alternative on tech. It's so oftentimes in Washington, that's the default, is we say, don't do this and don't do that. Well, our friends all over the global South have alternatives today they didn't have 15 or 20 years ago. And so my argument in my book, The American Imperative, was to say we need to up our game, because we can't fight something with nothing. So we are in a global competition. There are ideological underpinnings to it. Thanks for asking.
Well, you talked about Africa, and so I'd like to let Ambassador Ina respond to that. We see a lot of activity with Russia and China and Africa, a lot of economic investment going on from China and Africa. You live there. This is what you deal with every day. You are the expert on today. What are your thoughts?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Lisa, for having me. And I think I want to agree with the last speaker. He has spoken quite extensively, and those points are quite valid. And just recently, you will agree with me that the G20 admitted Africa as a permanent representative. Again, is in part of what you see happening to the entire continent. If you look at Africa, for example, with that kind of huge population of over 1 billion, you cannot just neglect them. You cannot give them nothing for something or something for nothing. It's very important to begin to consider them as an integral part of the decision-making process in the global affair. Until you begin to incorporate that process and then give Africa that relevance, then we are far from reality. And because of the issues that will be coming, and like you rightly mentioned, there are different opportunities that are available to the entire continent, from Russia, China. Now, if you look at the admittance of Saudi Arabia and a few other folks into BRICS, it's also an indicator of what is going to happen in the next couple of months. So I think the West needs to begin to look at how to begin to do a bit of technology transfer to the entire continent. There's been a lot of massive, movement of young folks from Africa, to the West, and they've suffered quite a lot over the years. And what the leaders are saying now is high time we begin to develop our resources in a way that we can begin to manage it. And you will also agree with me that because of the crisis in Russia and Ukraine, the issue of gas, fossil fuel, has become a major issue as well. And that is why they're proposing that pipeline that will go through Algeria down to Africa to Nigeria, which, as again, is facing a lot of roadblock. And Russia is saying, look, there are quite a lot I can do for you. Some couple of weeks ago, Russia was able to forgive the debt of Africans, to the tune of, I can't remember the exact figure now. And we must begin to look at that. If you look at Nigeria's GDP, or if you look at our revenue to debt servicing, is quite disgraceful, almost 100%. That means we can't do anything serious because all of the revenue that is coming in now is totally for debt servicing. And we have to begin to look at loopholes of where our crude oil is going and where we're not meeting up and a whole lot of that. I made mention of Nigeria because Nigeria plays an integral role in shaping the future of Africa. Today, Nigeria is the chairman of the ECOWAS, where all of the coup that we're talking about are happening. I read in the papers 2 days ago that Russia planned to pull out, from Niger to be able to pave way for peace and all of that. So the West must begin to see Africa as an integral partner, not just in paper, but in a way of implementation and driving, implementable programs, infrastructural development, technology transfer, and incorporate all of these processes to give Africa a sense of belonging that truly they can trust the West and they can rely on them at every point in time. They need a Nigeria to do that because the president is listening, and that is why Nigeria is yet to be a member of BRICS and considering all of the things on the table with the West to see how they can begin to, have that conversations around, supporting all of those infrastructural development and help the population, because if you look at the chunk of the population, they are living below poverty level. And those are very serious issues that might trigger a lot of problems in the entire continent. So I just want to wait there to listen to other opinions so that I don't take the flock totally. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
That's I'd like to just hop in there, Ambassador. That's spot on. Participation on the world stage for Africa is paramount. It cannot be a token seat in the theater. It must be an active participant in the process for geopolitical success to happen and to put the aristocracies and the autocracies back into slow-mo, if not stop backing them up. I see Shane head going up and down quite a bit. I think he has something to bring in here. Shane, please come on in.
I guess I just sort of really kind of connected with what the ambassador said and also what Dan said before. This sort of sense of competition and getting kind of caught up in it. To me, I think that right now we're facing a lot of issues that are, regardless of how we want to approach them, they're global issues. And they're mostly self-made issues. So we could talk about climate change, and we could talk about sort of how we're supposed to deal with AI and these other tech advances and how they're affecting our economies and our societies. And I think that talking about doing things like friendshoring and so on like that, just to kind of create some sort of resilience seems nice on some level. But because these are global problems, regardless, we have to find better ways to make global partnerships, and that includes dealing with the global South, where we're typically telling them what to do, rather than bringing them in as partners. But then also, so for instance, China, they're a competitor in a lot of ways to many of us, but we also have to find ways to work with them to actually. I don't know if it's going to be a case of sort of siloing what sort of problems are so we can create cooperation rather than competition. But I do wonder if that's not the kind of place where business diplomacy has a space, is specifically within that. And I'm not 100% sure what that would look like, but because business in general has a different set of desired outcomes than governments do, it seems like there might be a space for private enterprise to really step in and fill kind of that kind of gap to say, okay, competition, but then where do we find cooperation on these sort of shared global issues that we cannot solve on our own?
Well said. Lisa?
So, talking about opportunities for global engagement and collaboration, Henry, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Ambassador Lisa. I think that's a very important question. And this is, personally, I think there is a lot of areas for international cooperation, particularly in innovation, developing innovative solutions and new technology in the climate change and carbon reduction area. I think
And so, Dr. Yu, what are your thoughts? You're looking at this from a different perspective. What do you believe about this conversation on the global struggle, power struggle? Where are we at?
Is it for me? All right. So I think we still. It is very important to talk about the climate change, to talk about the equity in global partnership. But we often forget that we use words like competition. We use words like a market share, interdependency. We often forget to give the Chinese Communist Party its agency in deciding the global outlook, global engagement. We blame ourselves. We blame the Europeans, blame America. But we don't talk about China much. China is fundamentally not a country that has constitutionally protected property rights, for example, which is why private non-state sectors is in serious trouble. So what we're talking about right now is not just a competition, because China never defined its relationship with the rest of the world with soothing words like competition. For Xi Jinping, for every Chinese Communist Party leader, it's an epic struggle of life and death. So, in other words, competition can only have one winner. That's Chinese perspective. So their look is pretty like a zero-sum game. And also, competition in the Western world implies that all competitors would abide by the same set of rules. Not how China works. For example, we talk about climate change. China's CO2 emission just about 1/3 of global share. So, I mean, you cannot really talk to China about this equitable responsibility of this kind of thing. India may be in the same category. The United States CO2 emission accounts for about 11 or 12%. So that's a significant, but far less than China. So if China doesn't play the ball, doesn't follow the international rule, nothing can be done. Okay, so that's basically my point. My point here is we do not give agency enough to the Chinese Communist Party, and what we're talking about here right now is really a struggle, competition, or rivalry, as Europeans like to say, between two models of governance. The Chinese model of governance domestically is failing miserably. You have unemployment somewhere between 20 to 40%. You have this consumer confidence to the lowest level. Nobody wants to spend money. The economy is in a tanks. So, and the Chinese development model is based upon the massive debt, and now is coming to the end. Real estate is collapsing. China's social and political disenchantment is record high. So this is the model of governance China is trying to export overseas through Belt and Road, through many other initiatives and technological control. So what I'm saying here is, and I think we have to really pay attention to this complete incompatibility of a Chinese model with the rest of the world. That's where and China is so important. Some people say it's number 2 economy, and they play a very important role in global geopolitics. So I would just change the direction a little bit to talk about the biggest contradiction of our time, that is China.
Good points. Good points. I'd like to get a little asset management perspective here. Sergey, what are you hearing here today?
Thank you. I think to kind of build on the point that previous speakers have made, most of the countries in the global south, they are developing, and if they're democracies, then well-being of their own people is primary, which takes precedence over geopolitics or over even climate change or long-term goals of the world. So those would be Brazil, South Africa. Then on the spectrum, you have Turkey being next, where it's a democracy, but elections may be rigged often enough, and still staying in power, as well as the plight of Turkish people, is what would make the decisions about climate change, about geopolitics in rulers' minds the prevalent. And then, of course, China would be kind of on the spectrum where staying in power for the Communist Party is important, and as a secondary goal, well-being of the people eliminates or reduces the chance of not being in power. So that's what's in mind. And that's how, unfortunately, again, most investors have to increasingly pay attention to that, because efficient allocation of the capital, productivity, global competition, it's still possible that those developing countries have the industry leaders, the regional leaders, or even global leaders in certain categories. But you can, given what happened in Russia and how so many investors had to write down Russian investments down to zero, it's not really possible to completely ignore geopolitics. And in many cases, the investors would rather kind of, stay close to the West, at least be at the benchmark, or maybe underweighting the countries that are either totalitarian or don't participate in sort of, Western alliances, and therefore could eventually become subject to sanctions depending on the situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's keep talking China. Corey, come on in here.
Sure. I just want to make one comment on the discussion on Africa. The last couple years I spent in Djibouti, Africa, East Africa, and then I also did some work with Ethiopia pre-COVID. I really like what Dan said. It's time for us to up our game, not only as Americans, but as an alternative that doesn't just look at Africa as a recipient of aid, but looks at them as true partners. I had the privilege of leading a delegation in 2019 to Addis that helped bring Western entrepreneurs from Japan and the United States to coach and mentor young startups in Ethiopia. It was African tech by Africans for Africans. I think that's the model we need to pursue, in Dan's words, to up our game. But let me switch to China. I am 100% in agreement with Miles. What I talked about before was this flawed foundation of ascendancy into the WTO in 2001 that started with a lack of transparency and has not changed at all. And I would argue that it's even declined with three concerning trends that I've seen over the last 6 to 9 months. Trend number one is changes and updates to China's counter-espionage law that makes basic due diligence on M&A activity, audits, end user due diligence could be interpreted or perceived as espionage against the state. That's led to a concerning trend number two, which we've seen companies that are fully vested in bringing transparency and disclosure to the surface have been raided by Chinese authorities. I'm talking Mintz Group and Bain Consulting Group, which happened in August. And concerning trend number three is a slow shutdown of data that we see, being able to access information, corporate registry structures, et cetera, that you could actually make determinations on whether to de-risk or not. When we work with clients, and again, I was in Tokyo last week, I'm in London this week, when I talk to business leaders around the world, when I talk to governments around the world, there's more alignment that we need to do more to pressure transparency. And it's not about decoupling overnight, because I don't think anybody's in a position to do that right now. It is about a slow de-risking and then a long-term shaping of the solution. But it all starts with pressuring for transparency. In my opening comments, I mentioned anxiety. While there's alignment that we need to do more, There's also anxiety, and I think that's what's giving rise to these policies or incentive structures around countries. Japan, the Economic Security Promotion Act that was passed in May of 2022, our Chips and Science Act, the EU's Chips Act, I think are all showing signs of anxiety to try to friendshore onshore. It'll provide solutions long term, but I think it's a little too, or it's a little, I'm sorry, I'm messing that up. It's too little too late is what I'll say. And then finally, if we are going to reshape that transparency curve in, towards global rules and norms, it's going to require that we act in concert with each other, that we don't make unilateral decisions, that we need to get alignment up front and be more proactive about this. So I think I'll leave it at that and see if there's other questions that come up.
Fabulous. Lisa, how we doing over there?
Well, here's the question. We've had an amazing conversation today, and I know that we're in our wrap-up mode, and so appreciate having this diverse array of people representing the global perspective from all sorts of different angles. And I think one of the top things for me, Terry, is that the LinkedIn community needs to be thinking about these things. What we learned during the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that we had 1 degree of separation, many of us, to people that were dying and fighting for their lives. And that is what is the difference, as Dan pointed out, between World War II and other past conflicts that have existed. We actually know these people. The world expanded after the wall came down in the late 80s. And I had the opportunity, participating in a wide variety of manufacturing companies, to see expansion throughout the world. And so we know these people, and we as business people need to work with each other to ensure that we're a resilient system that supports free people and free markets so that we can all have the economic benefits that those bring to us.
Outstanding. Yes, and I totally agree. Politics has its place. Good governance has its place, but we're talking about business and changing the mindset of business and governments to understand that whatever we're doing with recyclables and backing up, bringing people to the table, a round table instead of a square one, and really get this participation of everyone, is to start looking at this from a business standpoint, because the politics standpoint is just not working real well. So let's change the way we do business to doing business instead of looking good for this country, looking good for that country. Let's get involved. Let's get everyone to the table, as we like to say in America, and get people involved. And any last comments from anyone today? Wow, this has just been a phenomenal exchange.
Thank you, Terry. I think, Ambassador Terry, I think that's a very important point that you brought up. And really, we've also discussed that in the G20, B20 task force, that really, with the current world situation and the de-risking, the decoupling, there is even more chance and opportunities for countries and global business to work together, to find ways to cooperate, particularly in developing innovative solutions and developing new green technology. So I think these are very important areas that we can all contribute to try to improve the world.
Excellent. Dan, you had your hand up?
Yeah, thanks. I want to thank Ambassador Gable, and I thank you, Ambassador Nichols. I go back to my point about we need a positive, forward-looking agenda that speaks to the hopes and aspirations of the West's friends and potential friends. The world's different from 25 years ago. We need a change with the times. But I do think that the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to kind of reset kind of the global system is going to fail, but it requires us to collectively work together. I think the institutions like the B20, like the G20, requires Western leadership, but also requires global partnership. And so we need to listen, and we need to understand what the realities are and what folks' hopes and dreams are, and speak to those in how we partner with others.
I like to mention one final thoughts I have. I think the geographic demarcation of the global economy is not really that helpful. West, Africa, Asia, Latin America. Those are those are it's very easy, very convenient. I think that right now we're facing is something that is more conceptually accurate. That is, we have to decide what is a market economy, what is a non-market economy, what is freedom, what is tyranny. This is a choice of the world. It's not whether we choose west or east. There are so many countries that are not geographically considered west, but they are sharing so many same values and principles of what we consider the west. India, Brazil, and other west. Japan, is Japan west? Yes, but no, geographically it doesn't make sense. Right now is not about really geography. It's about the models of governance. It's about the political, ideological divisions rather than geographical and even historical divisions.
Outstanding. Anyone else?
All right, Ambassador Terry, thank you so much for having me. I just want to say it's been a very wonderful and intriguing conversation this afternoon. And I just want to believe that for us to move forward, we should go beyond the rhetorics of talking and promises. We should begin to be intentional and deliberate about the kind of partnership, the kind of engagement that we intend to engage with going forward. I think at this point, Africa is tired of talking. Africa is tired of promises. Africa wants to see action, actionable deliverables that will impact on the lives of Africans, all across. So I think it's important that going forward, we should begin to match those words with action in a way to pacify the already tensed environment within the African region. Thank you so much. It's been a great opportunity to discuss with these great people on this platform, and I look forward to connecting with everybody. Thank you so much, and see you soon, or see you anytime soon.
That's it. That's it. Lisa, any final thoughts?
Well, I saw Sergey. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you, the ambassadors, for a great conversation. I think I agree with everyone who said U.S. should be more engaged, and obviously, as our political season develops, I think U.S. Electorate tends to kind of be a little bit more myopic when the times get harder economically, when inflation hits up. So, of course, we cannot become too isolationist, right? And as we see, there are quite a few front runners in potential elections that kind of don't care as much about international relationships, about supporting Ukraine, about building alliances. And of course, it would be important to see how the process works out. But to the extent that U.S. electorate continues to look at international reasons to be involved, to be engaged, that will play a role. Because of course, it would be a very difficult and different conversation in 2 years if we have Congress or White House that is just solely focused on U.S. problems and is not looking to support our allies throughout the world.
Corey, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I really appreciate the time, Ambassador Gable and Ambassador Nichols, and it was nice to hear everybody's perspective. I go back to, again, it takes a proactive posture. I love Dan's words with friends and soon to be friends. And that's really what it takes. I'm seeing more alignment around some of the structural flaws in the global economy. And I think, we're in for some potentially rough times ahead. A couple weeks prior to the illegal invasion of Ukraine, the CEO of BP was quoted as saying, "I don't consider geopolitics in my business decisions." Yet 2 weeks later, he had to divest a few dozen or probably over $20 billion because geopolitics considered his business decisions. And so I think we have to be very attuned to that as we think in other regions of the world. What could happen if we are still supporting that structurally flawed foundation of non-transparency? But again, thanks for the discussion.
Great. And thank you, everyone, for your discussion. And I just want to say to the folks that are watching on LinkedIn, share this conversation. I think it's one of the most dynamic and actionable conversations that I've heard in a long time addressing this topic. Engage with us, tell us your thoughts. And Terry and I look forward to being with you again. Terry, turning it over to you to close us out.
Wow, that's a good way of saying it. This was fabulous. Thank you ever so much to our guests today. And ladies and gentlemen, for those who are listening live, thank you very much. We look forward to your comments. And yes, I believe this is the 21st century. Let's start acting like it's in the 21st century. Let's stop leading the way and start saying, come with me, I can help. Okay? Like a good neighbor. Let's be neighbors and not geopolitical allies. That doesn't work anymore. Like I've said before, we can all go live anywhere for anything. And thank you very much. And that's the end of our stream today.